Hey, I'm Andy. I make music as and I'm also an audio engineer, producer, and drummer. And today I'm going to be talking about some basics of making jungle music. Roughly today I'm going to explore two different ways of editing breaks, one using audio, one using MIDI, and explore a few different bass sounds, such as like pitch sign modulation, some like womp style sounds, and a pitch drop effect. And this is what we're going to be making today. I'm going to start today with the Amen break from the song Amen Brother by the Winstons. Unedited, it sounds like this. Obviously that's too slow, so we're going to look at how to speed it up. There's a few different ways to do this, but in Logic, one way I like to do is using flex time here. So you've got to turn that on for the whole project up in the window here, and then turn it on for the individual region or track there. And then we're going to use this setting, speed, which when we speed it up, it also pitches up, which is how you get the pretty classic jungle sound. So we want this to go for 4 bars. The moment it goes at 170, it's going for close to 5. So if we go up to the top corner here, we get this flex editor, and we can click and drag and just bring it to the 4-bar point, and now we have this. Which is already starting to sound pretty jungle. I'm going to bounce this in place just for ease of editing later. From here, audio editing, I just like to split it up on various beats like this. I split it on the beat. You can tell some of the hits aren't quite on the beat, but I like to split it on the beats in order to retain the swing of the original playing when you reorganize it. Cool, so from there, let's make a little loop here. I'm just going to start copying little sections of the beat across and start reorganizing. And let's get another snare. Cool. Pretty basic pattern. Cool. So once you've got that, you can clean up some of the edits, but I'll look at that in a second. There's a few effects then you can do when you're editing with audio, such as re-pitching things. In Logic, if you go to this region section and you go to transpose, you can drag the pitch of certain regions up and down, which can sound like this, which is a bit ridiculous, but anyway, to taste. You can also reverse sections using this reverse checkbox here. Right, so to your heart's content, build a break as you see fit using those various techniques. Here's one that I made earlier. Take off these effects. So you can see these sections that are darker blue are where I've pitched down. We've got a little reverse hit somewhere in there. I've lost it now. There. I've reversed that snare. Yeah, so you just keep going until you have a pattern that you like. Once you have a pattern that you're happy with, you start to look at mixing it, changing the sound to suit your track. I'm not going to talk about how I made this, but I've got this pad I'm going to be working with, which, yeah, when you're looking at how you want your breaks to sound, it's important to do it to get them sounding good by themselves, but it's also really important to get them sounding good in relation to the other stuff you have going on in your track. So I'm going to start EQing, not listening to the pad, but later we definitely will be checking against it. Starting with an EQ. When I'm looking to change how this break sounds, it's like really important just to not just fiddle around. I mean, yeah, you can get cool results fiddling around an EQ, but I think it's really important to listen to what you have and really think about what you want to change about its characteristics. So listening to this, it's like the main things for me, it's a little bit muddy. I want to probably get rid of some of the low end. There's a little bit too much bright, harsh sounds, but that's to taste. And I probably want to bump up some of the mids a little bit. So if we look at what I did, yeah, I've got this low cut here. I'm just cleaning up some of the low end. Nothing there. I've also, yeah, just trying to control that kick a little bit, around 130 hertz. It's a bit muddy in there. A little bit more mud up above at 250-ish. In drums, there's often a lot of mud in that kind of area, which you end up with a much tighter sound. A, B. Cool, so then I've just done a bit of trying to control a bit of those highs, but I didn't take much off, just about 2 decibels, which really to taste. I'm also going to check that against kind of about how warm or how bitey or how aggressive you want it to sound. I wanted this to be a bit warmer, so I took back some of those highs in the cymbals there. And then, yeah, I had a little bit of a boost around here. This is really to taste. You can like kind of focus in on different aspects of the snare drum, like a bit lower down here. You get the snare a bit thicker. Here it's often a bit bitier. Yeah, that's really to taste, and also doing it in the context of the rest of your track is really important. So after the EQ, before. So it's a lot thinner, but we're making drum and bass, so I really want to make room for the bass. I don't really want the drums sitting down there that much. You can also layer in kicks and snares of separate individual samples, but here I'm going for a pretty traditional jungle approach of just using the break. Now that we've EQ'd and got some of the character we want from the break, I'm going to look at dynamics, which is basically like variations in volume. One way to get that is through distortion. So let me play without the distortion. distortion. It's a little louder overall, but it's actually technically a lot quieter, but it sounds a lot louder, which is a great trick for getting extra volume out of your tracks overall in terms of getting them loud. That's mastering. I'll let someone else talk about that. Anyway, so we're getting a bit of like character, a bit more character with the distortion, getting like dynamic control, which is just control between the loud and soft, and it's bringing out some of the softer elements of the break. Another way to be looking at dynamics is through compression. When a signal gets loud, it compresses it and pushes it down. So it's controlling the volume overall. But more specifically, it's controlling the loud parts of your signal and pushing them down in different ways. And the ways in which you push it down create different kinds of sounds. So the key, there's a lot of things. You open a compressor, there's a lot of things here. The keys, things that you want to be paying attention to are the threshold, the ratio to some extent, and the attack and the release. So when I'm going to bring the threshold back to 0. At this point, the compressor's not doing anything. You can see nothing's moving. As I bring the threshold down, you can see a number here. Anything at my sound signal that is louder than this number will start to be compressed. So as I bring this down, you see this moving down means that we're starting to compress the sound, which is to push the volume. Compressing is pushing the volume of it down, which you can hear at the louder points. That's with it off. With it on, you can start to hear it like pushing the sound together, squashing it together. So you want to set your threshold to a point where the compressor is actually starting to work. You don't want to go way too soft, or you might to totally squish your sound, but here I'm going for like a fairly moderate bit of compression that's kind of just hitting on the kind of loudest parts of the break to push it all together. The ratio essentially controls like how much it pushes it down when it goes over the threshold. So when you've got your ratio at 1 to 1, for every one bit of input, you get one output. So that's no compression at all. Basically, the higher your ratio, the more compression. The less your ratio, the less compression. Anyway, so then the most important thing here in compressing a drum break is your attack and release, which is how quickly the sound starts to compress and how quickly it stops compressing. The attack being how quickly it starts compressing, the release being how quickly or slowly it stops compressing. With drums, if you have your attack at 0, it's going to start compressing instantly. So every time there's a loud drum hit, the compressor's going to kick in and push the volume of that loud drum hit down. We want these drums to still be punchy, and the way to do that is to retain the volume of what's called the transient, which is the loud start of a drum hit. We want to not squash that volume because we want to get that transient, because that's where you get the energy and the power of, like, volume essentially equals power in this sense. So we want to let through the transient, which is if we make the attack slower, the compressor doesn't start compressing straight away. Right? So at 0, it's compressing instantly. Here, the starts of those drum hits are coming through, and there's like more punch to the sound. Really, just do that to taste. It takes like a long time of messing around with these things to be able to hear that stuff. But like as a rule, with drums, you want a fairly slow attack, and your release then is how quickly it stops compressing. So if you want to create like a sort of pump thing, you do a slower release will mean that after it has started compressing on the drum hit, it will stay compressed for this amount of time. On drums, as a rule, like if you're going for what we're going for here is kind of trying to get bring out the punch of the drums, but also maintain the overall, control the overall volume. We want a fairly quick release because we want the compressor to stop compressing fairly quickly so that the bits in between the loud hits don't get compressed. We want to kind of even out the volume between these things whilst not destroying the transients, which is why I've got the kind of slow attack. So yeah, you want a fairly short release time. If you had a really long release time, the compressor doesn't stop compressing and the whole thing just kind of ends up compressed at the same volume. But as you can see, at a shorter release time, the compressor stops compressing and then recompresses when you hit another transient. Cool, after the compression, I just added a bit more overdrive. Fairly subtle, but a little more aggression. And then finally, another kind of EQ. This is modeling a sort of more vintage EQ style, which I'm going to do in reference to the rest of the material. I'm just cutting off a bit of the lows, focusing a little bit more on the kick drum. What are we at? 137. Added a little bit of extra highs just to bring a bit of clarity back in, and a touch more energy in the mid. I'm just focusing on the energy of that snare drum, but honestly that stuff is all to taste and depends what else is going on in your track. So that's using audio to edit a break and construct a new pattern. Now I'm going to look at a new break and edit it using MIDI instead. So this time we've got the Think break, which is a song from a song called Think About It by Lynn Collins, which was written and produced by James Brown. It sounds like this. You should definitely go listen to that song. There's like 5 break samples in different bits of the song and you'll probably recognize all of them. So again, I'm going to speed this up into tempo. Flex time for the project is on, flex on for this, speed, again, pushing it. This is just a 1-bar loop. Now we've got jungle. So there's a few different ways and to convert an audio clip to work with it in MIDI. It varies program to program, and also within Logic there's like a whole bunch of different ways to do it. I'm going to be using the quick sampler, so I'm just taking this, dragging it down into the new region section, going quick sampler, original, and it drags it into the sampler here. Get a keyboard up. Now we have it available to be played. Yeah, there's all these different speeds, but that's playing the whole sample on like single MIDI keys, which is not what we want. We want to split the break up into different slices to play them on different MIDI keys. So I'm going to go into slice mode. And you can see it chops it up here, and now the different slices of the break are available on different keys on the keyboard. You can like put these slices wherever you want to taste. Just for ease, I'm just going to let them go in there where they went automatically. So now we have all of it available to us on a piano roll down here. So I created a new MIDI clip, and then we can start arranging our break down here in the MIDI window. Turn that off. After you've done this for a while, you start to learn what these notes are and kind of where they go in the pattern. Like this is a ghost note, and so they go on these like off beats here. I'm going to rearrange this slightly. For example, the joys then of MIDI, you have a whole bunch of things you can do. You can then change the pitch globally here. You can change the decay, the envelope, essentially, but I'm making the length of each sample a lot shorter. And then you have a bunch of other interesting, so we can do pitch automation. This time, instead of changing the pitch of an individual audio clip like we did before, we can automate all of these parameters. So we can automate the pitch and go to coarse tune here. I'm automating inside of this region. And we do stuff like, you know, this is really up to you. The other interesting thing that we have in MIDI, we have access to, is velocity. So if we take get this snare drum here, and change, here we can change the velocity of the various hits and create a sort of snare. Cool, so yeah, playing with pitch, playing with velocity. I mean, you can automate any element of the sampler here, really. You've got a filter, so you can be automating your cutoff and your drive. There's endless possibilities. Where we've got a bit of pitch effects, and you'll hear this, and you can see here some velocity. Move on to looking at some bass, a very important part of drum and bass. For this section, I'm going to be using this synth called Serum. Apart from the very last section, I'm going to try and keep it so it's pretty easily translatable to any other synth using some pretty simple waves and effects and stuff like that. This first sound I want to look at, I'm calling a bass drop. It's like a sub with a pitch drop effect. Sounds like this. So essentially what we have going on here is just a sine wave. It's just one MIDI note, as you can see, on an F. But we're getting the pitch drop effect from modulation within the synth. In Serum, you have access to essentially two different waves at once, A and B, that run through a filter that you can affect with various modulations. So there's envelopes, LFOs, which are all assignable. You just click and drag and you can assign it to anything, which is great. I'm going to keep it to pretty simple waves so that you can translate this into other synthesis programs. So with this sound, we have this pitch drop effect, which this LFO is creating. I'm going to turn that off for a second, and you can hear it's just a standard sine wave. To create this pitch drop, I have this LFO. Normally, yeah, as I said, you can drag the modulator to something that you want it to modulate, but to get the tuning of the wave, unfortunately, there's nothing to drag it to. You have to go across into matrix. So you'd select source, your LFO1, which we were on LFO1 here, to destination, global master tuning. And then, yeah, if I reset this amount, nothing is happening there. If I drag this amount up, the LFO will now affect the master tuning according to whatever curve you made here. You can hear that when the note starts, the pitch starts up and then falls down like this. When you get the LFO, standard, it looks like this. So to make it do the pitch drop, I dragged the middle across to the start, so it would start up. This was flat. I could turn it into a bit more of a curve. You don't want it, have it up there, it stays high and then goes low. We wanted it to fall fairly quickly. You can shape that as you see fit. My note was going for 2 bars, so I set the rate to 2 bars with BPM synced. If you turn that off, you get a hertz speed, which is like unsynced essentially. If I have this on envelope, then it just triggers once when the note starts, rather than the LFO cycling and going back to the start like while the note is still playing. We just want it to happen one time, so the pitch only drops once. So moving on to this next sound I've called a womp. It's like a bit of a wompy wub style kind of thing. It sounds like this. Cool. So there's a few aspects to this. One is the rhythm. I'm using what's called dotted eighth notes here, so a bar consists, which is on the screen here, you can see is from 43 till 44, consists of 4 quarter notes. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. An eighth note is half of a quarter note, which would be till there, till there. A dotted note adds half of the value of that note to itself again. So an eighth note would be this length. A dotted note adds half of that, and then you have a dotted eighth note. Only explaining that because the dotted eighth note and the dotted quarter note are lengths, note lengths like used and rhythms used a lot in jungle music. So this dotted eighth note, which is it moves it kind of off the straight grid to a kind of syncopated feel, which is a rhythm very much worth experimenting with. So building this sound, I'm just using a square wave here. I'm going to turn off the filter, and you can hear it's just a pretty boring square wave with no definition on each individual MIDI note. What I'm getting there is on each note on that rhythm, I'm using the envelope to open the filter, which you can watch happen there. To do that, I assigned the envelope 2. So envelope 1 controls the amplitude or the volume parameters. Envelope 2, envelope 1 is automatically assigned. Envelope 2 you can assign to whatever you want. I'm assigning it here to the cutoff of the filter with a bit of a slow attack, so that on each note the filter opens up and gives you that kind of womp sound. That's essentially the basics of this sound. I've also added some noise into the signal, which is mostly being filtered out. That's just an aesthetic choice. One thing that I have done is increased what's called the unison of the wave here. So instead of just having a single square wave, if you had one, which sounds quite nice, but I decided to increase the unison to 6, and it stacks 6 waves kind of on top of each other, and then you can detune them using this detune knob from each other, which spreads. That's this diagram. You can see it's sort of spreading the width in the tuning of them. They're relative from each other. I'll go more into this actually in the next sound, but it kind of creates phase modulation off of the slightly detuned waves, which adds to some movement and also some like stereo width in the sound. Versus, yeah, so you can set unison to taste. In terms of EQing this, I just rolled off some lows because I was focusing more on the highs, the mids of this sound here, but you could definitely keep that sub, and it sounded nice with a little bit of delay. And now we have this. Next, I'm going to look at what I'm calling some pitch modulation sine waves. I've got 2 examples of it, one exploring some more in-depth serum features. Essentially, what we're going for here is getting 2 identical waves. So I'm using sine waves in this case. And using the fine tuning, the sense, is slightly detuning them from each other by even amounts. So this one -30 and this one 30, so that they still oscillate around a central pitch. But when they're playing at the same time and at slightly different pitches, it means that the waves themselves are slightly different speeds. And as they oscillate at the same time, because they're different speeds, they go slightly in and out of phase with each other, which essentially it results in volume fluctuations as they go in and out of phase, which sounds like this. So I've just got one note happening there in MIDI. I'm not re-triggering notes, and I'm not doing any modulation like I was in the previous examples to get movement out of the sound. It's literally just because of these waves are detuned from each other. If I reset them both to be at exactly the same tuning, all that movement will be gone. And you have, honestly, a very boring sound. Reintroducing the pitch offsets from each other. Because I've offset them from each other by the same amount, it still sounds like the note that I'm playing on the keyboard, an E, but it introduces that volume fluctuation. If you change the amount that they're out of tune with each other, you get the volume oscillating, fluctuating at a different speed. So you can just play with this. Basically, if they're more out of tune, it will fluctuate faster and you'll get a faster volume modulation. And if they're more in tune with each other, like this, it'll oscillate slower. So you basically would just tune this, play with those in the context of your track, until you get a groove that you like the sound of. And this is quite an interesting approach because it's quite an imprecise way to end up with a rhythm inside your song, as opposed to MIDI often can be kind of come out quite clinical. This, it's like these synths, it's like there's no real relation to time when you're doing these synths, and you end up with some pretty interesting effects sometimes when you play around with this. In terms of, after this I'm just filtering off a bit of the highs and cranking the resonance and the drive a bit in this filter, and show you if the filter's off. Pretty boring. You can get a lot of different characters out of this filter. Cool, so now I've got another instance of Serum doing essentially the same thing. I've got the sine wave. I'm just going to explore some aspects of Serum that are quite particular to Serum that are quite interesting to explore when making this kind of bass. This one sounds like this. The first thing you notice, I've got two notes now. On that previous example, when you have this pitch modulation happening by detuning the waves, what note you play also will change the speed of the volume fluctuation, because the waves themselves are moving at different speeds because they themselves are different pitches. So when I have this lower note, the volume fluctuates slower, and then on this higher note, it fluctuates a lot faster, which is a very common technique in this style of music. We're having these fast fluctuating higher notes. People aren't, often that comes from not designing a new LFO or something. It's using this pitch based form of modulation. And again, you experiment with the notes, you get different rhythms, you get different speeds. It can help you decide notes. It's a really interesting way to approach it. So now I'm going to talk about some pretty Serum-specific stuff, quite specifically this effects page. Using some of the effects in Serum can be quite an interesting effect. One issue, though, is that when you start using distortion, particularly and reverb here, on your bass, you can really mess up the quality of your bass, particularly if you're like trying to make music for the club and you need like really strong, quite like simple sub, but interesting like upper harmonics in your bass. I'll show you, this EQ was actually removing the bass from the sound, but here, if I use these two sine waves with distortion and reverb, we have this sound, which doesn't have a super impactful sub and is a little bit distorted and messy. Instead, I'm going to take out the lows from that sound. And then what I can do is add in a sub in Serum, and then click this direct out button. The sub here, which is just a really simple sine wave, which will be very powerful on a big system, bypasses all of these effects. So you end up with a like strong sub underneath the bass sound that you've designed using these two other waves. If I didn't have direct out clicked, the sub would also be running through all of this and it would sound, which in the right moment could be good, but there's no bass in that. There are ways to achieve this not with Serum, and also different ways to do it without using the effects and the direct out. You could simply just have another track with Serum and the same MIDI and just a simple sine wave just playing the sub, and then you could have effects on your top bass sound, which is also a really common way to do it. But in Serum, you have the opportunity to combine it all together, which can be really powerful. Another important part of this sound is multiband compression. I'm going to show you the sound without this compressor on. And you notice when the high note plays, the sound gets a lot louder. I wanted to try and even out the dynamics of it. I'll show you with the... Yeah, so instead of just using compression to push down the overall volume of the entire track and all of it at the same time, with a multi-band compressor, you basically have a compressor on different frequency bands. So here we have a compressor acting on 20 hertz to 100 hertz, and you can change where this goes quite easily. Here we have another compressor from 100 to 460, 460 to 3,300, and then up the top. What this allows you to do is compress different amounts in different frequency bands. Because when that high note plays, I don't want to be squishing any of the sub. I want to keep the sub as strong as, which if I put a general compressor on, it would squish the whole volume and it would push the sub down. I want to keep the sub loud, but I want to squish the high frequencies. So when I solo this frequency band here, this third one, any time in this particular frequency range, the volume goes above this notch. You can change where this is the threshold from the previous compression example. It will start to compress. So you can see on the low note, no compression is happening. And then when it hits the high note, it is starting to compress, which you do to taste and by ear, and you can even out the dynamics, not just of the entire signal, but of each separate frequency section. Sample, and here in the low mids, not compressing much, and then when it goes to the higher note, compressing it a lot more, so that you end up with a more balanced overall bass sound. Now that we've got all of our sounds, we can look at arranging them in a track. I've done a pretty simple arrangement for this tutorial. Essentially, I've got an ambient intro introducing my first break in the next section, using the think break as a sort of more ambient style bridging section. Before then I drop the pad out and bring in the bass for like the big drum and bass jungle style drop, and then reintroduce the pad again in conjunction with my bass sounds to tie everything together, which obviously there are heaps of variations you can do in terms of arrangement, and like that's part of the art form. This is a like fairly simple and somewhat standard arrangement if you condensed a jungle song into 1 minute and 40 seconds. Thank you. Hope you learnt some helpful techniques today. Here's my track.